Welcome to That Cancelled Movie Show. As always, I'm your host, G-Mac, joined by my now paid intern, Jimmy.
Well, technically, you just gave me a half a loaf of bread.
Isn't that what money is called anyways? Today's episode, we are going to be breaking down and reviewing Christopher Nolan's Tenet.
I'm going to be your tenant soon if you don't start paying me.
You're killing me, Jimmy. Now this film is something else. If you thought his other features were complicated, like
Leo's Dream World?
no, it's called
Who's the Real Hugh Jackman?
What I'm trying to say is be prepared to take a university class on understanding this movie. Spoiler. Tenet tells the story of our protagonist, which is also the name of the character, the protagonist. And if you forget who you're supposed to be rooting for throughout the movie, don't worry, he'll remind you by saying, "I'm the protagonist," many times.
Aren't we all the protagonist in our own story? But what if in fact, we were the antagonist in someone else's?
The protagonist, played by John David Washington, works for the CIA, but is promptly double-crossed and killed. He is then resurrected by the shadowy organization known as Tenet.
Praise be, he hath risen.
Then a guy tells the protagonist about a plot to destroy the world. He gives him a code signal and a word, Tenet, and he says it'll open the right doors, but some of the wrong ones too. What does that mean? No one knows. The code signal is used twice, and it really never opens the wrong door. He uses it to gain the trust of an archaeologist named Barbara, which is played by, forgive my horrible pronunciation, Clément Prézy, so she can dump a load of exposition into our laps.
Boss, can I take a break? I need to drop a load of exposition off at the pool if you catch my drift.
That's not how the saying goes, Jimmy. And this movie has a lot of exposition. Some of it's warranted to explain the complicated nature of temporal inversion, like Barbara does, kind of. Actually, she just says, don't try and understand it. Now, this may seem like a cheap way to avoid explaining it completely, but what this movie doesn't need any more of is exposition. She shows the protagonist an inverted bullet, which means it can travel backwards through time, and she has him practice catching the bullet to get him, and us, used to the concept. And this makes for some interesting imagery, but during this whole sequence, she's dumping exposition on us. But this is done right, because it is showing and explaining. But the film continues this exposition dump throughout, and the rest of the times is boring to watch.
My exposition dump is over. You're out of TP, by the way.
Two scenes in particular stand out to me. The first has the protagonist go meet Sir Michael Crosby, played by the delightful Michael Caine, in a fancy restaurant so he can get some information on the man behind the terror plot. And there's a couple humorous lines thrown in, which I liked because Nolan's characters are usually so humorless. It's not a bad thing, but they're just so serious.
I happen to remember a clown in one of those. Clowns aren't so serious.
Crosby tells the protagonist about the main villain, Andre Sator, played wonderfully sinister by Kenneth Branagh, and how his wife can be used to get closer to him because of some counterfeit Goya painting. But all this information he gave him could have been sent in a text or placed in a manila envelope that those spies are so fond of. This scene is entirely too long. It just develops the protagonist's snarky sense of humor as he insults the snooty British waiters. But to be honest, this could have been accomplished a lot more fluidly and without the exposition. Then the protagonist goes to see Sator's wife, Kat, played by Elizabeth Debicki. He uses his own counterfeit Goya to get a meeting with her. Classic spy stuff. Then they meet in another restaurant and dump even more exposition on us.
Oh, my exposition dump isn't over, damn coffee.
We find out that she accidentally bought the counterfeit Goya from a friend with Sator's money, and now Sator holds it over her by threatening to take her son. Evil dude. But then the protagonist and Kat are interrupted by Sator's goons, a fight scene ensues in the kitchen, and Kat is spirited away. I want to talk about this fight scene for a moment. The protagonist uses the kitchen environment to fight the goons, even dragging a cheese grater across a dude's face. Brutal.
I could use some cheese to block out the exposition coming out of me.
It's very deliberate in its execution. The protagonist walks through the kitchen, fighting off goons, and the music hits with his hits. It's a cool effect. And during the lulls in the fight, the music is super low key. It reminded me of an old western where the hero is walking through an empty town, watching for danger. Next is the vault heist, which we see part of in the trailer. The protagonist and Neil, played by Robert Pattinson, are going to rob Sator's vault because he has something to do with the terror plot stored there. But the whole plan is explained using what? Exposition. Some of it's done well by hiding with clever editing, but there's one shot where the camera is just spinning around the crew as they explain the plan, but it just keeps going. It's almost as if the crew just let the camera go and lost control of, oh my god! Okay, so during the heist, the two Tenet agents find a piece of the algorithm.
Is that Al Gore's new rap album?
No, the algorithm is what allows things to be inverted in time. But they explain this yet again with more exposition. There was a scientist who created the algorithm, but she sent it back in time to prevent bad guys from finding it. It's unclear. And that's another problem with this movie. It leaves a lot of stuff unexplained. Usually I love films like this that make you think and figure stuff out on your own, but this isn't some subjective philosophical meaning. If we boil this film down, it's just save world from bad guy. So the addition of all this extra information jumbles up an already overcomplicated plot. And during the heist, we get to see the protagonist fight a masked, inverted man. And it's really strange to watch, but I liked it, because it was different than your average fight scene. The protagonist was moving forward, while the inverted man was going backwards. It played out like some improvised dance. And that's one thing I really liked about this film. The action sequences are so cool. Speaking of action sequences, we have another heist to steal another piece of the algorithm.
I think it's pronounced Al Gore's rhythm.
This one takes place on a highway where big explosions and crashes happen, but they are thwarted by an inverted satyr who is threatening Kat's life unless the protagonist gives up the piece of the algorithm. And I'm gonna stop right there and talk about the protagonist and Kat's relationship. It's unearned. I couldn't tell if they were romantically involved or just two strangers, because in one scene, the protagonist was kissing her cheek tenderly, but in the next they would just stand there like stiff boards and act like business partners. So when Kat's life was in danger and he gave up the algorithm to save her, I was like, what the f***?
Language, boss. My kids watch this show.
You don't have any kids.
My cats are my children. Thank you very much.
And another thing. If the world is going to end, why care so much about one person? It didn't make sense to me. Next, we are introduced to the turnstile, the time machine of the movie. The protagonist and Kat are captured and taken to another location, where the room is separated by a barrier of reinforced glass. One side is red, normal time, and the other side is blue, inverted time. The protagonist is on the red side with the goons, while Kat is with Satyr on the blue side. Then, a hard-to-understand negotiation commences. Since Satyr is on the inverted side, he's talking in reverse. But there's a translator that spits it out normally on the other side. However, it's so jumbled up that I could barely understand it. And that brings me to sound design. It's so bad.
It's so bad.
The music is overly loud, which drowns out the dialogue and hurt my ears in some sequences. And this also happens with background noises and when people are wearing breathing masks, which made it impossible to understand. So if you weren't straining your ears, it would just look like characters are chewing gum at each other.
You want some gum, boss? Sorry, I couldn't hear ya. This album is fire.
Let's fast forward a bit. Kat is shot by an inverted bullet and they have to rescue her by taking her through the turnstile and waiting a few days. It never really made sense why. So this takes us back to the vault, but in reverse. And we find out that the masked inverted man was the protagonist.
I am you, you are me. Let's come together and be free. Think I got a future in the rap business, boss? Probably pays better than this gig.
A little bit on, we find out that if Satyr dies, then the world will end by blowing up and burying the algorithm. To be honest, that part was also unclear. I understood that Tenet had to stop Satyr, but I didn't know why or how the world was going to end. And so, this begins the climax of the movie. Two teams of Tenet agents are going to perform a temporal pincer movement, which earlier in the film was exposited all over the protagonist. And for me, I didn't really need an explanation of temporal pincer movement, since pincer movement is pretty self-explanatory. The protagonist is on the normal team, while Neil is on the inverted team. This whole sequence is really cool. Get to see buildings blowing up in reverse. They crumble and then reverse and then crumble again. It's super interesting. Then we get to where the algorithm is about to be buried. But the protagonist and Ives, played by Aaron Taylor Johnson, are locked out and are stuck watching him prepare to end the world.
Why didn't they just shoot him through the openings in the barrier?
Because then there would be no point for an inverted body to fly up and block a bullet intended for the protagonist.
Oh, you're so smart, boss.
Well, the protagonist saves the world, and Kat kills Satyr. and they all live happily ever after. Well, not really. The protagonist, Neil, and Ives all have to kill each other since they know where the algorithm is located. But then they don't, and they're like, hey man, let's just chill. But if I see you again, I'll kill you. But hey man, have a beautiful time.
But if I see you again, I'll kill you.
But wait, what about the inverted body that helps save the day? We find out that it's Neil, and he's been with the protagonist from the get-go. Since the protagonist created Tenet in the future and recruited Neil and recruited himself. Now, if that isn't a mind I don't know what is.
Kind of like how you recruited me, but I'm actually a character in your mind that you created to stave off the looming specter of loneliness.
And that's Tenet. Some highlights of the movie were Kenneth Branagh's performance, cool action sequences, and the interesting concept. But the tons of exposition coupled with the terrible sound design and an overly complicated plot can and will take you out of what is otherwise an immersive experience. So for this movie, I recommend waiting until it's available to rent so you can rewind and watch those hard to understand sequences. But as I said last time, the movie theater is the best way to watch movies.
Where can I put my stuff, boss?
What stuff?
I told you earlier I was gonna be your tenant.
I thought that was play on words.
My words don't play, sir.
Okay, well, just put it over there.
Oh, and just FYI, my cats use their space as a litter box, so be prepared for that.
A hell of my own making!
What's that?
Okay, well that does it for that canceled movie show. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Look out for another one early next week where I break down and review Bill and Ted Face the Music. And if you're looking for something more relaxed, give This Podcast Is Cancelled a listen, where Graham and Dane comically review movies and TV shows every Tuesday. The link is in the description below. And don't forget to like and subscribe.
Hey, what about me before things are done, huh?
How could I forget our new sponsor?
That's right, Pornhouse Paul coming at you with the finest booch in all the land.
That's right, made from the most organic ingredients known to man.
That's right. And not only that, but it's cage-free. And since there's no middleman to jack up those prices, there's only one thing jacked about this booch, huh?
Tell us what's in it, Mr. Pornhouse. No, seriously, tell us what's in it!
Mr. Pornhouse is my father.
Thank you for that inspiring message, Mr. Pornhouse.
My pleasure, Gary. And look for Pornhouse Paul's all-natural booch in stores near you, pending FDA approval. And tell him Paul sent you. All right, I'm out of here. Thanks for doing that, by the way. It's all right, I wasn't wearing pants, right?
This is going on the internet.
Yeah, I wasn't wearing pants. There's so many cats.
Sorry about that. We have to pay the bills somehow.
Roy's rod rams my rear. Roy's rod rams my rear. Sally sells seashells up my sphincter. Sally sells seashells up my sphincter. Sphincter. Sally.